We had known each other long enough that attraction should have either faded or turned into something obvious. Instead, it remained suspended, unspoken, carefully ignored, quietly alive. We never crossed a line, not because it wasn't there, but because we both sensed how easily one step could change everything. And neither of us was ready to lose what we had. Our connection existed in restraint, in the pauses between words, in the way conversations drifted into subjects that mattered, then retreated before becoming too personal. I told myself it was discipline, maturity, control, that wanting something didn't mean acting on it. But the truth was simpler and far more uncomfortable. I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped holding back. What made it harder was how natural everything felt. There was no tension to resolve, no conflict demanding action. Just familiarity mixed with curiosity, comfort layered with longing. I realized that some of the most powerful emotions don't demand attention, they wait. And the longer they wait, the heavier they become. I didn't know how long we could keep pretending this was nothing. But I knew one thing for certain. Silence had become a choice, and every choice has consequences. The longer we stayed in that careful balance, the more aware I became of how intentional it all was. Nothing between us happened by accident. Every message left unanswered for a few minutes longer than necessary, every change of topic just before it became revealing, every moment we chose comfort over honesty. It was all deliberate. We were protecting something fragile, even if we refused to name it. I began to notice how often my thoughts returned to her during moments when my guard was lowest. Late at night, when distractions faded, or early in the morning, before logic took over. I wondered what she held back, what thoughts she chose not to share, and whether she felt the same quiet tension that followed me everywhere. The uncertainty was exhausting, yet strangely grounding. It meant this mattered more than I wanted to admit. What unsettled me most was the realization that restraint didn't lessen the feeling, it sharpened it. By not acting, by not speaking, we gave the emotion room to grow inwardly, gaining weight and complexity. I understood then that avoidance wasn't neutral. It was a form of engagement, a way of staying close without stepping forward. And as comforting as that distance felt, I began to question how long we could exist in a space built entirely on what we refused to say. Over time, I noticed how deeply our unspoken agreement shaped my behavior. I measured my words more carefully, filtered my reactions, and adjusted my presence around her without realizing it. It wasn't deception, it was caution. I wanted to remain close, but not exposed. And yet, the effort of maintaining that balance became impossible to ignore. There were moments when the silence felt heavier than honesty ever could. A glance held for a second too long, a laugh that lingered after the conversation ended, the subtle awareness of her attention even when she wasn't looking directly at me. These were not accidents. They were signals, quiet acknowledgments that we were both aware of what existed beneath the surface. What frightened me wasn't the possibility of rejection, but the certainty of change. Speaking the truth would alter the dynamic forever. It would demand clarity, commitment, or distance, and I wasn't ready for any of those outcomes. Yet as days passed, I began to understand that remaining silent was not preserving the connection. It was slowly reshaping it into something tense, fragile, and unsustainable. Something would have to shift, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't be accidental. I started to recognize how deeply the restraint affected me. What once felt like control now felt like pressure, building quietly with nowhere to go. I caught myself replaying conversations, searching for meanings in words that were intentionally neutral. Even ordinary interactions carried a weight they were never meant to hold, as if every moment contained a question neither of us dared to ask. What complicated everything was how safe her presence felt. There was no urgency, no instability, no reason to run. And yet, that calm made the silence more dangerous. It allowed the feeling to grow unchecked, to settle into routines, to become familiar. I realized that love doesn't always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as comfort, and that can be far more difficult to confront. I began to understand that restraint was no longer protecting us from pain. It was postponing a truth that demanded attention. The longer we avoided it, the more fragile the connection became, stretched between what we shared and what we refused to acknowledge. I didn't know when the moment would come or who would break first, but I knew one thing with certainty. balance built on silence could not last forever. By then, the quiet tension had become part of our routine. It no longer felt strange. It felt normal, woven into the rhythm of our interactions. I learned how to exist within it, how to move carefully through conversations, how to maintain closeness without crossing invisible boundaries. But familiarity didn't make it easier. It only made it more complicated. I noticed how my instincts began to shift. Where I once avoided emotional proximity, I now sought it in subtle ways: longer conversations, more attention, more presence. I wasn't trying to change the dynamic, yet everything I did slowly pulled us closer. The contradiction was exhausting, wanting connection while protecting distance. What I feared most wasn't losing her, it was losing the version of us that felt safe. The unspoken version. The one without expectations, without definitions, without consequences. But I began to realize that safety built on avoidance is not stability, it is suspension. And nothing suspended can last forever without either collapsing or transforming. Something in me was already preparing for that shift, even if I refused to admit it. As weeks passed, I began to notice the small moments that betrayed our careful distance. A glance that lingered too long, the subtle softness in her tone when she thought no one was listening, the way our hands brushed briefly and then pulled back. Each instance felt like a reminder that our restraint was not permanent, that beneath the surface, something undeniable was growing. I also became aware of how deeply I had come to depend on her presence, not in a needful way, but as a quiet anchor in my otherwise predictable life. Ordinary days gained texture and nuance because of her, and I found myself anticipating interactions, replaying them, noticing details I would have otherwise ignored. The feeling was intoxicating yet terrifying. It demanded attention and honesty I wasn't yet willing to give. What struck me most was how fragile this closeness felt. It was not built on declarations, promises, or even trust. It existed purely in the spaces between our words, in the shared understanding that neither of us was ready to act on what we felt. And I realized that such fragile bonds can either crumble under pressure or grow stronger in ways neither of us could predict. We were suspended in that uncertainty, held only by the quiet weight of our unspoken choices. The tension between us began to feel almost tangible, like a thread stretched tight, ready to snap or pull us together. I found myself hyper-aware of her presence, noticing every subtle shift, how she moved, how her eyes lingered on something, how her laughter carried hints of something unspoken. Each observation was a small revelation, a reminder that the silence we maintained was no longer neutral. I started questioning my own restraint. Was I holding back out of fear, habit, or genuine caution? The answer was complicated. Part of me wanted to protect what we had, this delicate, undefined connection. Another part, quieter but persistent, wanted to acknowledge what had already taken root. Ignoring it felt impossible, yet admitting it risked everything we had built together in silence. What unsettled me most was realizing how much power unspoken emotions held. They shaped my thoughts, influenced my actions, and lingered long after we parted. Restraint was no longer just a choice, it was a force acting on both of us, a quiet, persistent energy that could neither be denied nor fully controlled. And in that awareness, I understood that something had shifted irreversibly between us, whether we acted on it or not. By now, our unspoken connection had become a constant presence in my life. Even ordinary moments felt charged. Walking down familiar streets, sipping coffee, or hearing distant city sounds, all carried a subtle tension, a sense of anticipation that neither of us could name. It wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent, quietly shaping my thoughts and emotions. I began noticing how much I craved her attention, even in the smallest ways. A fleeting smile, a casual comment, or a simple glance could linger in my mind for hours. It wasn't desire in its usual, urgent form. It was a patient pull, a steady gravity that drew me closer even when I told myself to maintain distance. Each encounter became a delicate dance of presence and restraint. What struck me most was the realization that silence was no longer neutral. By not speaking, we weren't preserving the connection, we were intensifying it. Every withheld word, every avoided topic, added weight to what remained unspoken. And I understood, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that this tension could not continue indefinitely. Something would eventually have to give. The subtle tension between us began to reshape the way I approached every interaction. Even casual gestures carried meaning. The way she tilted her head when listening, the brief pause before responding, the faint inflection in her voice. Each moment became layered with significance, demanding attention I hadn't anticipated. I realized that our restraint was not absence, it was presence, carefully measured and quietly intense. I found myself replaying these interactions in my mind, dissecting every nuance, trying to understand what it all meant without risking exposure. The paradox was clear. The more I analyzed, the stronger the pull became. It was no longer a question of whether I felt something, but how to exist with it without shattering the fragile equilibrium we had maintained for so long. What unsettled me most was the creeping awareness that avoidance had limits. Silence and restraint had allowed our connection to grow, but they also made it more volatile. The weight of unspoken emotion pressed heavier with each passing day, reminding me that eventually, choices would need to be made. And deep inside, I knew that when the moment came, nothing would ever be the same again. There came a day when the tension felt almost unbearable. It wasn't a confrontation, nor an event of any significance. It was simply a quiet afternoon when our eyes met for longer than usual, and everything else seemed to vanish. For a fleeting moment, the boundaries we had maintained felt irrelevant, yet the consequences of crossing them were clear in both our minds. I realized then how much I had been avoiding vulnerability. Restraint had become a habit, a shield I thought protected me from disappointment, from imbalance, from exposure. But in truth, it only delayed the inevitable, the need to acknowledge what had been quietly growing between us all along. Avoidance could no longer contain the pull, nor the subtle, persistent ache that accompanied it. What struck me most was the power of subtlety. This wasn't a story of grand gestures or confessions. It was about quiet, relentless emotion, an attraction that demanded presence and honesty without forcing action. And in that still, fleeting moment, I understood that love, even when restrained, has a way of asserting itself. Whether we chose to act or not, it was already shaping our lives. From that day on, I became acutely aware of every interaction, every glance, every nuance between us. Ordinary conversations began to feel layered with hidden meaning, as though each word carried weight far beyond its surface. I noticed the way her eyes softened at certain topics, the subtle hesitation in her voice, the way a smile could linger just long enough to unsettle me. I also recognized how much I had internalized the restraint. My thoughts were consumed with her presence, and I began to measure my own reactions carefully, trying to navigate the delicate balance we had maintained for months. It was exhausting, yet strangely exhilarating. A constant tension that reminded me how alive the connection had become, despite the absence of formal acknowledgement. What lingered most was the realization that unspoken emotions are powerful forces. They guide behavior, shape perception, and quietly demand attention. Restraint had kept the connection alive, but it had also made it sharper, more urgent, and undeniably real. I understood that at some point, silence would no longer be enough, and the moment of reckoning would arrive, whether we were prepared or not. By now, our careful balance had become a defining part of daily life. I noticed how even small gestures, her hand brushing mine briefly, a shared laugh over something trivial, the fleeting intensity of eye contact, carried weight far beyond their simplicity. Each interaction left an imprint, subtle but undeniable, shaping how I moved, thought, and felt around her. I also began to confront my own fear of vulnerability. I had spent so long convincing myself that restraint was protection, that keeping feelings hidden meant preserving stability. Yet now, I realized that silence had become both a barrier and a pressure. It preserved the connection, yes, but it also heightened every moment of proximity, making the unspoken pull almost unbearable. What stayed with me most was the understanding that meaningful connections do not always announce themselves. They grow quietly, persistently, in spaces between words, in pauses, in moments of shared attention. And as I navigated this delicate terrain, I recognized that the eventual choice, to speak or remain silent, would define not just what we were to each other, but who we were becoming in the process. There were nights when I would lie awake, replaying even the smallest exchanges, analyzing the weight of her words and the meaning behind her silences. The restraint that had once felt safe now pressed against me, a constant reminder that we were dancing on the edge of something inevitable. Every choice to remain silent carried consequences I could no longer ignore. I noticed how easily I became distracted by thoughts of her presence, how a memory of her laugh or a casual glance from earlier in the day could occupy my mind entirely. It was no longer just curiosity. It was a magnetic pull I could neither resist nor rationalize. The restraint that had protected us from uncertainty was also building a tension that demanded acknowledgement. What unsettled me most was the subtle realization that our connection had already changed us. Even without formal confessions or declarations, we were no longer the same people who had first started this quiet dance. Unspoken emotions had the power to transform, to shape behavior and perception, and the longer we waited, the stronger that influence became. Something had shifted irreversibly, whether we chose to confront it or not. By this point, every interaction carried its own gravity. I noticed how my attention sharpened in her presence, how I caught myself lingering on details I had previously ignored, the tilt of her head, the subtle shifts in tone, the way her eyes seemed to search for something unspoken. It was no longer just awareness, it was anticipation, a quiet tension that threaded itself through each moment we shared. I also became aware of the contradictions within me. I wanted to act, to speak, to close the distance that had quietly grown between us. And yet, I resisted, afraid that doing so would disrupt the fragile equilibrium we had maintained for so long. Silence, once a shield, had become both a comfort and a trap, holding us close while keeping reality at bay. What lingered most was the understanding that restraint is never neutral. By holding back, we had preserved the connection, but we had also intensified it, creating a quiet urgency that hovered in the spaces between words. And as I felt that tension build, I realized that a moment would soon arrive when remaining silent would no longer be possible. And the choice we made then would shape everything that followed.